Hi, this is Michael Silverblatt, and welcome to Bookworm. Today my guest is Paul Auster, the author most recently of Leviathan, that's been published by Viking, author as well of the New York trilogy, The Music of Chance, Moon Palace, In the Country of Last Things, as well as of a newly expanded book of essays called The Art of Hunger, being brought out soon by Sun and Moon Press. I thought I'd begin by asking what the first book by Beckett was that you read.
The first book I read by Beckett, if I'm not mistaken, was Malloy, the first book of his trilogy. And I think it's pretty safe to say that it changed my thinking about what writing could be. It had an enormous impact. I think I was 18 years old at the time.
For me, it was Watt. And, you know, something does alter about reading itself when you read the same words repeated in different variations across the page. You feel the words massaging your eyes in a way that you wouldn't under other more normal circumstances, perhaps outside Gertrude Stein. And so, you know, it was a quest for books that would make me feel that way.
Well, Watt is filled with that kind of material. Page after page of so-and-so turned to so-and-so, who turned to so-and-so, back and forth, back and forth. I think that's one of the funniest books of the 20th century in the English language. Yeah. And I still know passages of Watt by heart because...
Which ones? I do too.
Well, there's one of the funniest paragraphs I can think of is, I can't remember where in the book. It goes something like this. Watt conceived for Mr. Graves a feeling little short of liking. In particular, Watt liked Mr. Graves' way of speaking. Turd and fart, he said, for third and fourth. Watt liked these venerable Saxon words. And when, sitting on the sunny stoop, with his twinkle in his old blue eye, Mr. Graves looked up and said, in mock self-deprecation, "'Tis only me turd or fart," then Watt felt that perhaps he was prostituting himself to some purpose.
Oh, that's wonderful. You know, once I was sitting with Hugh Kenner, and Kenner had said, you know, I don't think Beckett has ever mentioned Laurel and Hardy by name in any fiction. And I said, yes, he does. In what? He said, he does? I felt very happy to be up on Kenner. But in the addenda, Watt runs into a gardener who remembers him from childhood and says of him, "You used to wet your pants." And Watt says, "I wets them still." And he shows him a bush called the hardy laurel.
That's it, yes.
And at night in his journal, Watt writes, "Made merry with the hardy laurel." To what extent, or to any extent, would you say your own style has been influenced by Beckett's? I know the content to some extent, but the writing style seems fairly aloof.
I think, in the end, my style has very little to do with Beckett's. And in fact, I think my books have very little to do with Beckett's books. It was just a moment in my life, and a long moment, before I actually started writing fiction myself, when I felt that he had, in some way, reinvented the possibility of narrative. If you look at Joyce, his mentor, who had taken what you would call, I suppose, the realistic novel to its very end. It's sort of the logical conclusion of what's possible from realism. And then you look at Proust, who took another direction and also wrote the great Rocky Mountain range of realistic fiction that no one really can get higher than. Beckett, of course, was the first man in English to write about Proust, and he knew Joyce. He came out of both of them. And I think he just understood that that kind of modernism was finished, and that if you proposed to write prose fiction anymore, you had to start all over again. And I think he performed an act of radical surgery on what the novel can be. And that's what interests me. The fact that his books go in a certain line and speak about certain things is less important than the formal breakthrough. And I think that's what marked me. Finally, I think my works are filled with a lot more hope than Beckett's, and they're much more grounded in some kind of everyday existence. But I think it was the mental and artistic courage on his part that had the greatest influence on me.
I was wondering, you know, when I had read that Kafka had admired Robert Walser, I immediately had to read Jakob von Gunten. a novel about a young man who realizes that in order to live, he's going to learn how to be subservient. And so he enters a school for butlers, the Benjamenta Institute. But Kafka, is another one of those writers who seems to have effected a radical break with everything before him. So one's relieved to find an acknowledged secret precursor. Who are the other writers for you?
The other writers for me, well, Kafka is one of them, certainly had an enormous impact on my thinking about what fiction can be. But I would say the single most important reading experience I ever had was when I was 15 years old and read Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, and it was at that moment that I understood that I wanted to be a writer. Nothing had ever affected me so much as that book. And I said to myself, if this is what a novel can be, then I want to do it. I had no idea what I was going to say. I just understood that this was the rest of my life, was going to be writing. In addition to Dostoevsky, Americans, Hawthorne and Melville, have always been important. Poe, I read starting from the age of about 10 or 11. Thoreau, a little later, is someone I keep going back to. And then, surprisingly enough, Dickens, who I think is probably, after Shakespeare, the greatest writer we have in the English language, kind of endless cauldron of inventiveness and linguistic play and daring, I think. He's willing to try anything. And he remains a source of great inspiration to me, Dickens. And Kafka, too, was influenced by Dickens.
Oh, sure, and especially in America, I think is where he acknowledged the influence. I'm always surprised now because what happens to Dickens had been my favorite boyhood writer, and now, although I still love the prose and the characters and their ways of speaking, I find myself so impatient with the ways in which the novels are put together that I don't read more than 40 or 50 pages at once. It's sort of, it could just be the effect of modernism on me, is that I have to break down Our Mutual Friend into modernist fragments and then read it that way.
But it's funny you mentioned that particular book, because I do feel that is his greatest work. It's the last finished book. And it explores so many contemporary subjects, fragmentation, money, the law, in ways that are, I think, very, very contemporary still. And it's interesting. My wife, who's also a novelist, wrote her dissertation at Columbia on that particular book, Our Mutual Friend. We talked about it for years at home.
Well, we're talking about it still. It's a great book, and has perhaps the most damaged people in it prior to 20th century fiction that one's likely to encounter. In fact, I think that what with the spontaneous combustions and the strange habits of noses to sprout protuberances and an interest in being crippled, I think Dickens certainly is pre-Beckett.
Absolutely. Mr. Venus, the articulator of bones. It's a wonderful character. Jenny Wren, the storyteller. It's all very much alive still.